editor, executive editor of the Jerusalem Post, columnist for Haaretz, U.S. News and World Report, and then many years ago he started at the Washington Institute of Near East Studies, where he's a Ziegler Senior Fellow. I thought I put it in big fonts, I wouldn't need my glasses, but I'm still. Ziegler Distinguished Fellow, Director of the Project on Arab-Israeli Relations, and Derwin Levy Family Program of the U.S.-Israel Strategic Relationship. He's the author of multiple books, and some of those include Making Peace with the PLO, the Rabin Government's Road to the Oslo Accord, Engagement Through Disengagement, Gaza and the Potential for Renewed Israeli-Palestinian Peacemaking, and the last one before this most recent book that he's going to talk about is Myths, Illusions, and Peace, Finding a New Direction for America and the Middle East. It was on the Washington Post bestseller list, also co-authored with Dennis Ross, and some of you who are here, I know were here. Dennis Ross spoke twice in this room, I believe, as well, and I think that that was one of the books that he spoke about in one of the last two visits, and I signed it on his absence for some of my classes, and it was a very good book. And of course, he's also written multiple reports for the Washington Institute of Near East Studies on all kinds of issues related to Israel, Palestinians, peacemaking, U.S.-Israeli relations. I always advise students, and it's great to see so many students here today, to look at the Washington Institute of Near East reports. And one of the wonderful things they have that Devin Makovsky also started is this kind of mapping thing where you can look at how a two-state solution could be viable when it's based on the 67 borders with land swaps, and it shows you many different specific options for land swaps from within the 67 border, for land outside the 67 border, and it's a fantastic tool for students. Many of you have probably seen David Makovsky on the PBS NewsHour or heard of him in NPR. He's written many, many op-eds in all the major newspapers that one could speak of, so he's pretty prolific and has been speaking in many TV and outlets and radio outlets. So, but what we're here today is to hear his most recent book that just came out, also co-authored with Dennis Ross. It's called Be Strong, of Good Courage, How Israel's Most Important Leaders Shaped Its Destiny. It highlights 4 Israeli prime ministers on war and peace issues, starting with Gurion, also looking at Rabin, at Begin, and at Sharon. So some of you several years ago heard me talk about my book on Israeli prime ministers. I look at 6 of them, and there's 2 of them that overlap. But it's a very, David Makovsky and Dennis Ross is a very important book. I recommend it to everyone to read, and we're going to have lots of copies in the desk in the back after the lecture and discussion. You can purchase and get the book signed by David Makovsky. He has a lot of great insights. He's talked to so many of the players and decision makers across the Middle East. I think tomorrow or tonight he heads to Abu Dhabi. So he really, whenever anyone comes up, he's talked to them multiple times. And so there's all kinds of jewels of good information. It also kind of makes us think about the leaders we may be looking for today, and the difference they can make on war and peace issues. So there's a lot of reflection, I think, for discussion as well on contemporary issues. And Makovsky has written about recent Israeli elections and other things, and has a lot of interesting thoughts on that. I wanted to quickly thank our co-sponsors, so MSU Hillel, the Greater Lansing Jewish Federation, James Madison College, the Residential College of Arts and Humanities, the College of Arts and Letters, the Asian Studies Center, the Political Science Department, and the History Department. And I'm again glad to see many students here. We have some information on the back on study abroad in Israel. We have a lecture next week with one of our visiting Israeli scholars, Lihi Lahat, on her research in the Political Science Department. We have an Israeli movie coming up that you might be interested in, and there are flyers for that in the back. So please take a look at that before you leave, and enjoy the lecture, and please, let's have a lively discussion. And thank you. I know some of you are here for some of your classes. Professor Mark Bernstein has a sign-up sheet in the back for his class, so please, sign when you're done in an hour and a half with the lecture and the discussion on your way out, sign so that you can get credit, and hopefully this will be a memorable experience that you'll be happy that you were encouraged. I know there'll be a memorable experience that you'll be happy or encouraged to come to. So thank you so much David Makovsky, for fitting us into your busy schedule. So,
Thank you very much. Can you hear me? Can you hear me in the back? Can you hear me in the back? Better? Better. Okay. So I want to thank Yael, who it's a mutual admiration society, and I wish there were more academics around the country that really try to study Israel from within the way she does. And it's really an honor to be back here at MSU. So thank you, Yael, and thank you to all those co-sponsors that you mentioned. I'm here to talk about my book. I'll start by saying that Yael mentioned a website that I have called Settlements and Solutions that tries to drill down a little bit about what is the intersection between settlements and borders. Happy to discuss it in the Q&A. Just started a new podcast last week called Decision Points. You go to your favorite podcast and you can just put in my name or Decision Points, U.S.-Israel Relationship. And the idea is to interview 10 authors who are historians, policymakers who wrote about different periods. I hope to do a season coming up, maybe after that, on the peace issue, like the book. But we just started this. I'm very gratified by the response. Twitter, at David Makovsky. I'm told, make sure you say this to people because people don't know. So look, why did we write this book, Dennis Ross and myself? And why did we choose the title we did? That's biblical, be strong and of good courage. Because we do understand that that the Middle East is not an easy area. And you look at the Kurds who have been abandoned, and that often stateless people are defenseless people. And that's a lesson that Israel learned. But you also want a situation that you're not just strong, but you're wise. And wisdom and courage is not easy. It means sometimes, going up against your political base. And we chose 4 leaders who really met the bar of history and were willing to go, after having gone through some sort of an inner transformation or course correction, and were made historic decisions. We just feel that people are despairing. We live in an age where the problems sometimes look to be too big, and therefore people just think you can't solve anything. There's no role models, there's no paradigms to look towards. So I went in at Dennis's office not too long, it was the day after the last election. I said, let's inspire people. Let's get them to think about leaders in history on the issues of war and peace, peace in particular, that where they made historic decisions. Why do we write this now also? Because we're a bit concerned as people see themselves as centrists on this issue, that Israel might be reaching a tipping point, that if there is no decision taken, Israel becomes one state for two peoples, a state that, a binational state, which was not the idea of the Zionist founders. And we are, Yael knows I like baseball analogies, so I don't know if we could hit the home run on this issue. I was part of the Obama administration and for Secretary Kerry. We tried to solve this whole conflict, but Clinton tried before us in 2000. Condoleezza Rice tried in 2007-8, and I was part of the team in the Office of the Secretary of State 2013-14. We're looking for solutions that give dignity to both sides. And to hit the home run, not easy. You have to do what I call 5 for 5. The borders, security arrangements, Jerusalem, refugees, mutual recognition, you accept the character of the other side of the state. We felt that the overlap, that the Venn diagram does not overlap on these 5 for 5 issues. There were gaps. I felt in my time, the leader would agree to one of the 5 and want the other 4 issues to go his way. We feel that there's a need to have this sense of, that there's at least hit some solid signals. to try to, even if you don't reach a destination, head in a direction that doesn't shut the door on two states. We don't think two states is going to happen tomorrow. We think the Palestinians are divided between Abbas and Hamas, Abbas in the West Bank, Hamas in Gaza. There are other reasons too, but we feel that there's a demographic tipping point, that you have over 100,000 settlers now outside the security barrier. The security barrier is such that 87% of the settlers are basically inside that barrier, 8% of the land adjacent to Israeli urban areas. And if you had a two-state solution, you could have land exchanges for those people, so most of the settlers are incorporated into Israel, sovereign Israel. But if you build outside, you don't really have that opportunity. So our plea is not to shut the door, not because we think two states are going to happen tomorrow morning, but because we want to maintain an option of having that happen in the future. And if you entangle the communities in such a way, there's no chance of solving this. So that was kind of the broad idea, but instead of writing like a think tank kind of book, we wanted to write an interesting book that people would read about people, about leaders, about what makes them tick, about who these people are, what their journeys were, and where did they change, and therefore, why did they make such a historic decision? As Yael said, we chose 4, not because we think these 4 are perfect people. They were certainly flawed. We say, are these people the 4 you would put on a Middle East Mount Rushmore? I'm not sure, but they were, some yes, but I think that they made 4 historic decisions, 4 people, 4 decisions. We want to trace their journey, and then what does it mean going forward? So the 4 I'd like to talk about briefly, but are David Ben-Gurion and his decision, the road to statehood, and Begin's road to peace with Egypt, Rabin's road to Oslo, and Sharon's road to Gaza, of disengaging from Gaza. What unites them? They were very different people. They were people who were 2 more from the Likud, right of center, 2 from the center left, Labor, and Rabin, I would say, Begin and Ben-Gurion didn't even speak to each other. Ben-Gurion referred to him in the parliament as the man who sits next to Mr. Bother in the parliament. But what united them was a sense of country first, and sometimes your base doesn't like when you decide, but you have to put the country first. And these were people who did that. So I thought I'll talk briefly about each and then open it up for conversation and look forward to the discussion. What made Ben-Gurion a unique figure in history, the novelist Amos Oz called him a walking exclamation point. He could be volatile, but he also had a stoic side to him. When he got locked in on a position, you couldn't budge him. He thought, after 2,000 years, Jews should not be homeless. They should have their own state, because stateless Jews were defenseless Jews. He felt that 2,000 years of pogroms, persecution had to end, and he wanted to devote his life to that. In that sense, he was strategically very fixed, on objectives, but he was tactically agile in terms of how he got there. Where did he make his course correction, his transformation? I think first of all, what drove him? I think the 1930s were key for this guy because of Nazism. He was at a Munich train station and he picked up Mein Kampf. He's one of the great autodidacts in history. I think he taught himself 13 languages. He read Mein Kampf in German, and he came to the conclusion Hitler has just been named chancellor a few months earlier. He's serious, and he said in 1934 there'll be a war in 5 years, and the World War started in 1939. He said that in 1934. 5 years, we just commemorated the 80th anniversary of World War II's beginning. And he thought it was a foot race between Zionism and Nazism. But he saved the Jews before Hitler killed them. He didn't, of course, know 6 million were going to be killed He had no idea, but he felt that he does not have the luxury, he does not have the margin of error to make concessions on immigration, to say, oh, well, we don't need to push immigration, because immigration was really where the rubber met the road. That was where the two nationalisms, an Arab nationalism and a Zionism, were at odds. Do you allow open immigration? The British are stuck in the middle. They're running the mandate. And they started this with Balfour. We just commemorated the 102nd anniversary of the Balfour Declaration this Saturday, where they talk about recognizing a national home for the Jewish people. But as they get more and more on the ground, they said, uh-oh, we're stuck between these two competing nationalisms. We don't like being in the middle of this. But as the 30s go on and war seemed more likely, the British felt, we get more out of the Arabs, we need the Arabs more if there's going to be a war, because there's more Arabs than there are Jews. And they turned very much on Ben-Gurion with the 1939 white paper. There's a whole history leading up to it. We don't have the time here to get into all the details. But basically, Ben-Gurion says, you know, your new white paper is that Jewish immigration is phased out in 5 years, 15,000 immigrants per year, that's it. And then, you know, basically the Jewish immigration is over. He says, look, I'm worried the Jews of Europe are going to be killed. I don't have that luxury. We have to bring as many immigrants as possible. He was on a collision course with the British as much as he wanted to work with the British. Chaim Weizmann, who had some differences, but he was in London and they were partners in this Zionist endeavor. But as the 30s wears on, he sees that he's on a collision course. Now, where's his transformation? Is in the 30s, in the 36 riots. He said he always thought there was going to be Arab nationalism, but he didn't get the Palestinian nationalism, the local nationalism more. And he came to the view that Zionism should accept half a loaf. And that was the Peel Commission of 1937, the British Commission, which the British government repudiated with the white paper. But it says you each get half a loaf. The Palestinians said, we don't accept they getting half a loaf. We don't think they're legitimate to get half a loaf. We think we should get all of the loaf. Ben-Gurion came to the view, because of his belief in immigration, it's better to have full sovereignty over half the land than less than full sovereignty over all of the land. And that was controversial in the Zionist rank, but he stuck to it. He said, look, the main thing is open the borders for the immigrants. That's what it's about. And if I could do that, so we have half a loaf. He said if the Arabs attack us, we could always then expand the borders, because they'll lose the moral authority to commit only to the half if they attack us. But so that was a shift in Ben-Gurion. It started in 37. It goes to 47 with UN partition. But what I think was one of the most dramatic moments, which I want to just talk about briefly, was something that, I mean, it sounds like a Hollywood script, but it's a true story. I go through Hebrew transcripts, and the question is, and now you can say in retrospect, well, the British were leaving the mandate, they were sick of the mandate, they wanted to turn this thing over to the UN, you know, World War II, they're depleted, the empire is in trouble, there's no appetite anymore for sacrifice in Britain, given how much they were ravaged by World War II, and they wanted the focus to be inward. But the question was, do the Zionists declare a state? There had just been a vote of the UN partition for half a loaf. Again, Palestinians thought that was illegitimate. The Zionists don't deserve half. But the key thing comes down to May 12th, 1948, when they have to decide, okay, going to declare a state or not. And Ben-Gurion is just hit by a lot of bad news. His proto-foreign minister is a guy by the name of Moshe Sharet, originally called Shurtak, Moshe Shurtak, who meets with George Marshall. George Marshall just won World War II. That's a pretty big deal to win World War II. He was more popular in the United States than Harry Truman. It's called the Marshall Plan for the recovery of Europe. It's not called the Truman Plan. Because Marshall was very popular, and he was the Secretary of State. And he met Sharet in his office with all these maps, and you can imagine it being intimidating. And he said to him, you know, I'm worried that you get intoxicated by your generals. You have a few successes, and In the case of Sharet, the Zionists, he's referring to the opening of the road to Jerusalem, where the Zionists could get supplies in. There was a siege, and he said, I don't think you could win this war. And, coming from the guy who won World War II, that's a big deal. And don't rely on America. We're not going to bail you out. The U.S. had an embargo not to help the Zionists. People always think the U.S. facilitated Israel, but the truth was the U.S. had an embargo on both sides. And the first weapons sent to Israel by the U.S. were defensive weapons, the Hawks, in 1962, 14 years after the state was founded. First time an Israeli prime minister was invited to step foot in the White House, 1964, 16 years after the state was founded. People don't know that. Anyway, point is, Marshall tells Sharet, forget it. I don't think you can win. I don't think you should declare the state. I have an idea of a UN trusteeship. Let the UN, it's a new organization, let them run things. At minimum, Mr. Sharet, don't declare the state now. Let's have a 3-month ceasefire. We could avert war. And Sharet brings the bad news back to Ben Gurion. There were no direct flights, as I like to say, living in Washington, there haven't been direct flights till this year from Washington to Israel. He flew to Greece, he flew to a dirt airstrip at night in Tel Aviv. On May 11th, he went right to Ben Gurion's house. He gives the full report. He's not able to move Marshall. They didn't know for sure if Truman would agree to establish Israel. There was like kind of a fog about that. And then at the end, and you'll see why this sentence is important, he says to Ben Gurion, and I think he's right. I think Marshall is right. We should wait 3 months. Ben Gurion says, according to the Ben Gurion biographers, give the whole report, Moshe. Tomorrow's the big vote, but don't tell him the last sentence. Don't give him your personal view. Just give him the facts. And let the people hear. There were 10 people in this cabinet that were going to decide. There were 2 from Jerusalem who couldn't make it because the roads were too perilous. There was 1 that was abroad. That was one piece of bad news. Second piece of bad news. Golda Meir dresses up as a Bedouin woman, goes to Amman, meets King Abdullah of Jordan, had a previous conversation with the king in November about staying out of war, and said, look, the Palestinians won't accept the half a loaf, but if you want half a loaf, you take it, just don't attack us. That's the deal. You got half a loaf, you got the Arab half, we don't want it, you take it, but don't attack. And the Arab Legion were British funded, they were British trained, they were the best Arab army at the time. And he said, look, it's true, I wanted that deal, but now we have an Arab war coalition of 5 countries, and there's going to be an invasion, and it's going to start very soon, and I'm not an independent agent. I cannot just cut my own deals the way I thought in November. He offers her, maybe set up the Hebraic Republic of Jordan for a year, and you'll be part of the Jordanian kingdom. She said, thank you very much, but that's not what we wait to establish a state for. Then out of a line out of Mel Brooks, he said, what's your rush anyway? And she said, we've been waiting 2,000 years. I don't think we've been impatient. So she goes back, and at the cabinet meeting, she writes a note to Ben Gurion and said, there's going to be war. In other words, the mission failed. So you've got Sharet bringing bad news from Marshall, and you've got Golda Meir bringing bad news from King Abdullah of Jordan. And so then the third piece of bad news is during the meeting, it turns out there was a massacre of like 120 people, many women and children, of a place called Gush Etzion, which was one of the few Jewish areas in the West Bank, and the army was too weak to even send in reinforcements. And that was demoralizing, you could say. The whole area is small, and the war, Israel lost 1% of its population. I mean, imagine today if it lost 85,000 people, or if America lost 3 million people. I mean, it's just, the numbers turned out to be staggering. And the Palestinians lose people too. And they lost the numbers as well. So the fourth piece of bad news is that the military commanders are asked to speak. And the cabinet ministers, this proto-cabinet, provisional cabinet, is asking the general some tough questions, like, what do you think we should do? And they said, look, we're not getting into UN trusteeship, that's political, we're not political, we're military. But frankly, it would be useful for us to have those extra months. 35 to 40% of our people are not armed. Imagine Israel, which prides itself today on being a regional power from maybe the strongest from Marrakesh to Bangladesh, that this country does not have pistols, even. And so 4 pieces of bad news. If you read the transcripts in Hebrew, the ministers are kind of sympathetic somewhat. Some of the questioning is sympathetic to the idea of delay. Ben-Gurion gets up, and Ben-Gurion understands that part of the idea of leadership is to lead the public, not just reflect the public. And by the way, he was in the Blitz in England, he was in the underground, he was reading Greek apparently, and he thought with Churchill, a leader who can articulate why people are sacrificing, people will sacrifice if a leader knows how to communicate with them the purpose of their sacrifice that's for a greater cause. And he thought that could be done. He said, look, this ceasefire idea, I'm against it, I'll tell you why. I don't think it's gonna be implemented fairly. Who's gonna implement this ceasefire in Iraq? They're about to attack us. Nobody. Who's about to implement it in Syria? They're about to attack us. Nobody's gonna implement it. Who's gonna implement it in Jordan? We just heard. Nobody. Who's gonna implement it in Egypt? They're about to attack us. Nobody. So, where is it going to be implemented? Maybe we implement it asymmetrically on the ground. He said, I don't think it's a good deal. And he said, look, I'll tell you one thing, and this I thought was very poignant when you read it. He said, look, the whole idea is having our own borders. And if we have our borders, we could get the immigrants in. That's why we're doing this whole project, that we could open the gates to this country to our immigrants. And we also have the weapons that the Czechs are willing to give us, the Czechoslovakia. We couldn't get them because the British patrol the shores. They're leaving. We'll now have access to those weapons. And the Jews around the world, they care about us. The people care. The people from DP camps, they'll come. If we can open the gates. We have like the key to the gates. We have to open those gates. And the vote, again, I don't think it was a hand vote because no one wanted to go on record that they were against the state. And all of these people are Zionists. The issue is more of a delay than it is whether there should be a state, of course. But from what I could gather, what people think, some people think there actually was a hand vote. I don't see the evidence, but I think it's clear that judging from the comments, it was 6-4. And the person who cast the deciding vote was Sharet, the one who said, I think Marshall is right. He actually swings to Ben-Gurion. And so instead of them being deadlocked at 5, it's 6-4. And that's how the state of Israel is born. So it's an amazing story for me, writing this and researching it and going through Ben-Gurion's diaries in Hebrew and all this stuff, to see this sense of, of this leadership that was very unswerving when it came to goals, but was agile when it came to means. And that was, that was great. I would say with Ben-Gurion, the note for him was this idea that, the Holocaust, he didn't show emotion like show tears, but I should add that he went to the DP camps in 1945, right after the war ended, went right in Frankfurt, and he was greeted like he was the Messiah. And he saw emaciated people who had just survived the war, who just came liberated from the camps, and he cried. And he said, what has been done, we cannot repair. But we can bring you, the state is for you. And he made 3 trips to these DP camps. As a leader, he also saw the value in attracting public attention to a cause. Truman was interested in getting 100,000 of the DP people to Israel. The British were against it. And I think he also thought his visits would make an impact. But I think he really had a keen sense of leadership. Always try to look ahead, look around the corner. Don't look at just today's headlines, look beyond them. I can tell you that, when others were thinking of 1945 about what's going to be the Haganah versus Palestinian irregular forces. He said, look, he told a group of philanthropists, he said, it's not just going to be the irregulars on both of our sides. We're going to be facing formations of states, air forces, tanks. He said, I want people who fought in World War II on the British side or on the American side. Mickey Marcus was an American general. I need generals who had fought big formations. And he fought within the Haganah and the Palmach. The Jewish state was more configured to fight local forces. And he said, no, we need generals of big formations. And he fought them. And this wasn't hard. This was hard because these were his friends. And he said, no, but the state requires we think big. We got to reshape the army. And he did it. So I'm just telling you, he always put the national interest first, as he interpreted that. Doesn't mean he didn't make mistakes. He could be very stubborn sometimes. But I think in the big picture, he had what a leader needed, which was a clear objective, a means to get there, and a belief that you might have to compromise to get what you want, but don't lose sight of your goals. And he had that. And he was willing to make the historic decisions. I'll say very briefly on the other three. Begin was a different figure altogether. He was more a product of Europe. He was in Europe longer. Ben Gurion had left Europe in 1906. Begin's family was killed in the Holocaust, and he carried that with him. Begin was a believer that Zionism and civil liberties goes hand in hand. When there was martial law in some of the Arab cities until 1966, he said, look, these people are citizens of our country. There's no justification that they have martial law. This has to be lifted, and it was lifted. He was always an outsider, but he had really one idea that I think, another idea that I thought was also very compelling, which was there was a time when he was in the underground, in the militant underground, that he held up a piece of paper when there was something called the SAIS, when it was seen that the Haganah, the rival group of the mainstream Zionist leadership, was turning in some of the Irgunis to the British, and someone said, let's start killing Haganah people. And he held up a thin piece of paper, and he said, you could have a just idea, but that just idea could be contaminated very easily. The line is as thin as this piece of paper. I think with him, whatever ideological attachments, but you have to put the national interest above your local interest. And again, like Ben Gurion, he was not just what are the risks of action, what are the risks of inaction. That was what Ben Gurion was always wrestling with. What if I don't decide? That's a decision too. And he believed that just like it would be too risky not to decide on the state in 48, Begin faced a similar choice with Sadat at Camp David. And he knew that he had to make tough decisions. He said, I don't want to rule another Arab people. But people said, if you get out of the Sinai, you're giving up strategic depth. You've set a precedent. Israel gives back land. You're taking down settlements in the Sinai. It'll be used against you on the West Bank. But he said, look, Israel's fought wars, 48, 56, 67, War of Attrition, 68 to 70, the Yom Kippur War of 73, and 2,600 Israelis killed, many more Egyptians killed, I should add. But he felt, what if I don't decide? What if I don't do this deal with Sadat? The right wing will be mad at me if I make this decision, but if I don't decide, then Sadat might go back to the rejectionist camp. So Egypt is the most important Arab state, the most populous Arab state. And there's no war coalition without Egypt. If we do a deal with Egypt, we end the interstate war period from 1948. So if I could save lives, it's worth it. And because if he goes back to rejectionist camp, there could be another war. But if we keep him out of it, then we might have ended this era. And he did. Now, of course, there are non-state actors like Hamas and Hezbollah, but they don't have air forces or tanks or anything like that. So I think that Begin was vindicated in many ways. He was vindicated that he was right, that the risks of inaction were greater, and that this peace endured. It's often derided as a cold peace, but it worked because it survived the assassination of Sadat. It survived 2 wars in Lebanon, 2 intifadas with the Palestinians, and it even survived the Muslim Brotherhood coming to power in Egypt. And if you look at the GDP of Israel, in the 70s, 40% of it went either to the military or servicing military debt. Today, the percentage of GDP that goes to the defense is about 6%. And that's over $100 billion a year of savings that goes to quality of life, like building universities, hospitals, clinics, schools, roads, sewers, and all sorts of things. So infrastructure. So I think Begin made a big decision, but it wasn't easy. He came back and there were demonstrations against him. The right wing held up umbrellas, calling him Neville Chamberlain. He's an appeaser. His comrades said, you're giving up Israel's strategic depth, you're making Israel more vulnerable, and yet he stuck to his guns. So I think that this is something that is, again, a historic move by someone who saw the big picture and put the national interest above his own comrades, his own allies. And he understood the risks are not just of action, but of inaction. Rabin and Sharon were different in a certain way. They were younger, they were born in the state, they were sabras, and they took the state they didn't take it for granted, but they felt their role was to consolidate the state. They didn't declare the state like Gurion. Their job was to deal with the military, and back to 1948, they were commanders in Latrun, where you had people getting off the boats from Auschwitz, from the concentration camps. They were given a rifle, teenagers, and they were killed in battle. And I think Rabin, who had a scholarship to Berkeley to study hydraulic engineering, that he said, look, either we professionalize this army or this state is not going to make it. We cannot have the situation that you survive Auschwitz, but you die in Latrun. And I think this was really important, that people like him devoted their lives to the state. He goes on to be chief of staff. He wins the Six-Day War in 1967. Sharon, if Rabin was someone, I think, I'll get to Sharon in a minute. Rabin was a believer, and he had a second chance of being prime minister, having been prime minister in the 70s. But I think he comes at a fortuitous moment. The Cold War just ended, the Gulf War just ended, and there's this conundrum which says if you're strong because your patron is strong, the United States, you don't have to compromise because your team won the Cold War, your team won the Gulf War. But he felt, wait a second, if you're strong and you don't have to compromise, and you're weak, you can't afford to compromise, when do you compromise? And so Rabin said, when you're strong, that's when you cut through that dilemma. When you're strong, you're at the peak of your power, that's when you cut your deal. And he went to Oslo. He paid with his life for that decision, but he believed that about the demographics, as I started this talk, that if Israel's Zionist ship is to have two wings, to be both having a Jewish majority, but also be democratic. And he believed this would be a danger if they don't partition the land. And he paid with his life. Now, I would say Sharon, if Rabin was known for his intellectual honesty, Sharon didn't seem to have that dilemma. Was not known to be that way. But Sharon, undergoes a transformation himself because he had a very instrumentalist view of settlements. He looked at West Bank settlements as a military person. And when he put in settlements in southern Gaza in 1971, he thought, well, they'll block advance of Egyptian tanks. But in 1971, they didn't foresee 1979, the Begin peace treaty with Sadat. Suddenly, people said, well, what value do these settlements have? And when Sharon becomes prime minister, and he really said, what you see from here, you don't see from there. You're changing. As prime minister, I have a different perspective than I had when I was lower down, and I really think that these settlements don't have the value I thought. This was not easy. He was the architect of the settlements movement, and now he said, look, we should take it down. We don't want 8,500 settlers among 2 million Palestinians. We have to guard them. This is expensive. There's violence, and the right turned on him. They called him a traitor, just like they called Rabin a traitor. But Rabin thought what he was doing was in the national interest, and Sharon thought what he was doing in the national interest. And he said the national interest is to get out of Gaza. Not easy. They both underwent change, Rabin and Sharon, just like Begin and Gurion did. And their transformation, I think, led to big decisions. But it came at a price. In the case of Sharon, he was vilified by the right. He said, I'm leaving. I'm starting my own party. You don't appreciate me, but I won these land. Rabin and I were commanders. We fought for the land. We won the war. Now we want peace. And so they paid a price. Sharon, in his case, it was a debilitating stroke within a month of leaving Likud. But what unites them was the sense that if you're the leader, don't kick the can down the road to your kids, to the next generation. You're the leader, you have to decide. And Sharon really felt, I think, that he said to Dennis, and we have this in the book, I'm worried, he said, that the next leaders after me, who are not of the founding generation, they won't make historical choices, they'll make political choices. What ensures their own political survival? So I think these are stories of those of you who read Joseph Ellis, Founding Brothers, and John F. Kennedy and Ted Sorensen, Profiles in Courage. We obviously would never compare ourselves to any of these people, but we think this is kind of the Israel version of those two books, of people who were founders, who made tough decisions against difficult political odds, and yet believed they were doing it because they thought it was in the national interest. So it was a delight for me to work on this project. Just the declassification of documents, the State Department during the Begin period of Camp David, the Israeli documents are also available now, going through cabinet transcripts right after the '67 war when a lot of this was discussed. This was a delight for me. Even the Mossad cables are now declassified of a secret meeting between Egypt and Israel before Sadat's historic visit to Israel. So I guess I end with a plea, just that I just hope that this spirit of these founders who made tough decisions at great price, that somehow that spirit will permeate. We don't think you can hit the home run now. There's maybe nothing transformative, but you can avoid closing options. It keeps your options open for the future. And that signals to both publics that, not to have this profound sense of disbelief. If you look at the polling data of Israelis and Palestinians, about 50% on each side say they're for a two-state solution. But then they ask the follow-on question, does the other side want it? Oh, them? Hell no. Is it going to happen? Never. And that sense of profound disbelief, I think, means that, that people will not believe anymore what is said. They'll only believe what's done. So if you said to me, David, what's a solid single? If you can't hit a home run on this issue, what can you do? Specific, explicit. So I would say, here's one thing on each side. That each side does one thing politically hard. And each time it deals with the gut fears of the other side. How do you relate to the gut of the other side? How do you put yourself in their shoes? I think the gut fear on the Palestinian side is land. That if we defer issues, we would be conceding issues. If you say, I'm not going to build outside the security barrier, where 104,000 settlers are, there are a minority of settlers, maybe 13%. The large majority of Palestinians live outside the barrier. The majority of Israelis live inside the barrier. That would suggest there could be two states. But you don't have people on the other side of the barrier. But the Israeli side has got a strong argument too. the Israeli gut is, what are you guys doing on terrorism? What are you teaching your kids in the schools? Are you teaching them that Israel is here to stay, that each side has a right to live? And I think here, that issue of education and really this whole idea of making payments to relatives of suicide bombers or perpetrators of violence, you know, the Shin Bet has interrogated people who have thwarted, where they've thwarted attacks. They've asked them, why did you try to do this? They go, because under the rules, the Palestinian Authority gives money to my family. You know, it's triple the average. I don't think no details, but I know that our family will be taken care of, you know, in perpetuity. And I think that sends a message. You're not a partner if you're incentivizing what we call pay to slay. So I think each side has to do one thing that appeals to the gut fears of the other side. And I think that's why the singles approach. Do one thing, but one thing that at least has public resonance that the other side will recognize. That was hard for you to do. I know that was hard for you to do, but they'll at least say to the other, you know, you're a partner. And I just hope that people draw inspiration from these four leaders who made these tough decisions. The decisions they made were even harder in many ways. But I hope that it's an inspiration for the people who read it and people who care about what happens to Israelis and Palestinians and want them all to live in dignity, that they will look to these leaders and draw strength and good courage from these leaders who made historic decisions. Thank you all very much. Okay, any questions? Let me call the students in the beginning and then we'll move to the non-students. Yes, sorry, back. Are you a student? I can't see back here.
I was at LCC, but not at MSU. I just come to lunch.
Okay.
So how close do you think Israel and Syria were to a peace deal prior to the Syrian, to the Eritrean, and of course Syria's civil war breaking out? They seem in the media as someone
Right. There were really a couple of major efforts. In 2010, there was Fred Hoff and Dennis Ross, my co-author, was also involved. Before that, 1998, a guy, I know this sounds bizarre, but the cosmetics magnate Lauder, the Lauder family, like Estee Lauder, but he was very close to Netanyahu, and the Syrians thought that he would be a back channel. And then, of course, there was, during the Rabin period, there was really three times. In 94, 95, there was an effort too. But each fell short, you know, so it didn't amount to anything. And I think so long as you have Iran and Syria, and Iran is back Syria, and given the brutal civil war, I don't see any leader of Israel now getting off the Golan Heights.
Yeah, just with the issue of the Golan Heights, it's of strategic value for Israel to protect itself from Syria or Iranian proxies, but is it of any theological? That's
no, great point. And that was always the allure of this issue, was what you said is absolutely right, which is it did not have the sense of biblical patrimony, like the West Bank or Jerusalem.
Or Sinai did.
Or Sinai. Well, Sinai was also outside of the borders of Israel. And that's why Begin, who was very much focused on the biblical and the traditional and the historical, was more open. It was more a strategic depth issue for Begin, and the Golan would be kind of in that same category. But the advantages you had on the Golan deal were no biblical patrimony issues, and also Assad was a decider, unlike the West Bank, where the decision system was a lot more complicated. So there was an allure there that if you could split Syria from Hezbollah, then it would be a strategic win. But ultimately, the Syrian civil war intervened, and this never happened. And I think so long as Assad is alive, given that he's killed 600,000 of his own people, I don't see an Israeli government right now leaving the Golan. And I think it's a good question. Other questions at the back? All right, also go to non-students can ask too. All right, okay, Mr. Howard. Rabin had an advantage. Having won the Six-Day War, gives you a lot of street cred. He was a very highly analytical general. I tend to believe that the three chiefs of staff who came together in the blue-white group, led by Benny Gantz, Gabi Ashkenazi, and Yalon, and I should disclose that Isaac Koch, who was not part of them but is friends with them, was just at my institute for 6 months. The more I see these guys, and I've gotten to know them a bit, I see in them, look, in the case of Gantz, he reminds me of Rabin in terms of his personal disposition. There's a kind of humility to him, a shyness, a modesty to him that is a throwback to old Israel. That is not the new age, like Bibi Netanyahu or Ehud Barak, who are blitzier, hyper-articulate. These guys are not. But Ashkenazi, I do think, has some charisma. I mean, Gantz looks like he's out of Hollywood central casting of what a general would look like. He's tall, silver hair, blue-eyed, good-looking, you know, and he's personally very humble. And the public likes that. He kind of exudes a kind of inner calm that is steadying. And I think the public has felt that things have been a bit frenetic lately. But I think what I see on a deeper level, beyond the cosmetics and the personalities, the deeper level is what I see emerging from the generals, or ex-generals, is a kind of, I don't have a good phrase for this yet. I'd love to kind of sharpen it more, but is a kind of army consensus figure who, I know for Americans, we hear military, we think militaristic. In Israel, it's not a coincidence that the generals who, whether it was Rabin or Sharon, see themselves as pragmatists. It's like these politicians can pop off ideologically on settlers or on all sorts of issues, but the generals are like, okay, give me the big picture and give me the data on the ground, and don't tell me how, like those four leaders, more like, don't tell me how you like things to see the world as it is. Don't lie to yourself. And all these guys, I think with these four generals, their view is you need accommodation with the Palestinians. Not because there's going to be peace tomorrow. I keep saying, I don't think there is a two-state solution tomorrow. But you got to start down that road so you don't preclude your options, because you want to maintain the character of Israel's founders with the two wings of the aircraft, as I call it. And that, I think, is what unites them. And I see that the bench that they have behind them, these generals, of people who are very impressive. And what unites them is this sense of pragmatism, which is, I don't know, we can't solve all the problems tomorrow. I like to put it this way, and I know I'm not the only one who uses this phrase, but I've always believed this. If you can't solve the conflict, the alternative shouldn't be managing the conflict. The alternative should be shrinking the conflict, to do what you can. And I see these generals in that context, the people who feel this is a debilitating conflict, and if you want to maintain Israel's character, what makes them centrist, and let's say not left of center more, and there's the left shrunk a lot in Israel with the Intifada, the decimation of the peace camp from 2000 to 2004 that never really came back, because people stopped believing that peace is possible tomorrow. But they do believe that doesn't mean you make things worse. You've got to make things gradually better for the Palestinians, so they see a sense of possibility in their lives. And I think the generals are very much of that. They've been of the school, they've been lobbyists, you know, for the most part at the top echelon, of lowering the chances of violence in Gaza. It doesn't solve the problem, in their view, of having more conflict. It gives people, when people have nothing to lose, they're desperate. You don't want that. You've got to do more infrastructure. Even though you're not on the ground in Gaza, there are things you can do. And that I see in these three generals, and if I count Eisenkot, the fourth, they're all the same school of thought, which is you know, you can't be on the end zone on this issue. You know, maybe we're not going to solve everything, but that should not be an excuse to solve nothing. And I see in them, you know, what I saw in Rabin, in some of these people. Doesn't mean they're equal to Rabin in stature, but I think that they represent a consensus position, and I'm very much encouraged by that. I realize for people who are not junkies in Israeli politics, you don't follow every, twist and turn, we're kind of in mid-gear in an amazing moment in time, and we don't yet know how it's going to play out. And maybe by November 21st, we'll know more, because a certain time to form the government is done. Likud has basically been in power as prime minister. It doesn't mean they haven't been other configurations of unity for 32 of the last 42 years. This is the first time, certainly since Olmert was in power in 2006, that there could be someone other than Netanyahu who will have a different approach. Again, not a polar opposite approach, because I think Netanyahu is risk averse in many ways, and he's not an adventurist on war. But I think the general's view is we're civilians, we live in this country too, we don't just have a military outlook, we want pragmatism. We want to try things that shrink the conflict, even if we can't solve it altogether. So I'm very encouraged by that. Does that mean in this coalition formation issue, I know they will prevail? I think they have a shot because of these corruption allegations swirling around Netanyahu. It looks like there'll be an indictment before the end of the calendar year. But it's complicated because in Israel it's not enough to win. You got to get 61 like-minded people in your coalition, as you know, in the 120-member parliament. And getting the math right of getting these smaller parties on your side is complex. I'm happy to talk about this for years, but I'll move on to the next question. Yeah.
So I have a kind of a broad question.
Sure.
It's a two-part question. First is how much impact does the United States have on Israeli policy? Not just influencing, but let's say like sort of really an empirical, measurable impact on Israeli decision making. And secondly, let's say in the last two presidential administrations, has the United States shown any, aside from the things that we see in the paper on an ongoing basis, is there any consistent change in policy from the United States towards Israel?
All right, these are big questions. Look, there's no doubt that, I think on existential issues, Israel feels it can only rely on itself. I think the twin forces of Zionism was an ethos of self-reliance, a belief that only Israelis should die for Israel. If you have Americans dying for Israel, it's the surest way to destroy U.S.-Israel relations. So you might get American hardware, but only Israelis die for the country. No American blood should ever be spilled. And I think that's consistent, but the other twin part of it is always reaching out to the dominant power. It started with Weizmann and Balfour Declaration, and it goes on to this day, and Israel's very proud of that tight relationship that has grown by depth and breadth since Marshall met Sharet on May 8, 1948, where there was an embargo, and an Israeli wasn't invited to the White House as a prime minister until '64. Now the military, they're very intimate. The political establishments are intimate. So the depth and breadth of U.S.-Israel relations, I'm plug for my podcast, Interviewing Historians, is to talk about that evolution. So it has clearly evolved in depth and breadth. But there have been different approaches. There's no doubt that President Obama took a tougher position on settlements and on a declaratory level. But having said that, he also said what's out of bounds is using security, military aid to Israel. That's sacrosanct. Whatever Israel's policies, we want Israel to survive and thrive, and we don't want to risk its position. And both he and Trump had another consistency that was not exactly Israel related, which was they both thought the U.S. was a little overextended in the Middle East, and they both want retrenchment. Now, Obama and Trump have rhetorically, oceanically different styles. I think I put that as an understatement. But where the consistency was they wanted retrenchment. And that is interesting, and when we talk about differences in policy, we have to keep that macro kind of point into place. So while Trump abruptly pulls out of Syria, and I feel portrays the Kurds who killed 11,000 were killed to fight ISIS. America, we lost 6 people. The Kurds lost much more. And in a vacuum is filled by people that are hostile to us. But each president felt we were too involved in a certain way. They were all happy to help Israel militarily, economic, and with military aid. But you fight for yourselves, which is what Israel says. No American should die for Israel. Now, having said that, Trump probably did things that, I would have said, you're making, like you opened up a Jerusalem embassy, which I think was justified, given that we do business in Jerusalem since 1949, with every Israeli prime minister, with every president of Israel, every American president speaks to the Knesset, every American administration deals with the ministries in Jerusalem. And even if the Palestinians get 100% of the land of East Jerusalem, West Jerusalem will be always Israeli, and the Palestinians say that, and maybe certain neighborhoods in East Jerusalem too. So, but you could say, but stylistic, it's not just stylistic, but maybe you could say, okay, that's a great card to give. Can I get something for it? Now the word quid pro quo has become a taboo word in America, so whatever phrase you want to use. But I think, even though I think the move itself was justified, I think, you could have gotten something in return for it, that's all. So they've had differences in approach, in rhetoric, in style. They've been united that military aid is not part of the political game, and it's outside that. Now, I don't want to get into too much American politics here, but you see Bernie Sanders and a little bit of Elizabeth Warren maybe kind of challenging that. Now, that is different. But Obama and Trump have both kept that kind of out of bounds in trying to influence. Okay. All right. Right over here.
Yeah, so 2 questions comments.
Yeah.
First, the power imbalance between Israel and the Palestinians, militarily, is quite obvious.
Right.
So is it right to expect equality in gesture making between the 2 sides? It's not capacities. That's the first question. The second question is, I think that all these, I would say 3 out of the 4, except for Rabin, have made very cut and dry decisions about doing something. It was a black and white decision. Rabin was the only one that tried to go kind of an in-between way with the Oslo Accords, giving the Palestinians some authority over the cities, but not over the whole area. And isn't that one of the arguments that is against the Oslo Accord? It was as if something was achieved but not really achieved, because 5 years later Israel had to go back.
Right. I'm glad you asked that. I see the 2 questions as actually related, because it gets to the whole idea of the nexus point between policy and politics. In a democracy, you need to win public opinion on your side. That's just the way a democracy is. And so for the first question, when I say, I didn't say the gestures are equal, I think each has to make a move, because they each have to convince their own public that there's a partner on the other side. And the way you do that is to relate to the issues that actually impact the other side. So for Israelis, it's terrorism. For Palestinians, it's land. And I'm not making a moral equivalence between the 2. I'm just saying that's what the publics will respond to. So I think it's fair to ask for one tough political decision, because ultimately you need public support in democracy. And right now, the public in Israel, and you know this coming from Israel, has lost interest in this issue. This issue is not at the top of the charts, because this issue is seen to be abstract on a certain level. When your borders are lighting up with Hamas to your west, Hezbollah to your north, Iran to your east, you just seem to have the urgent pushes away the significant. And so therefore, this issue may seem abstract, but I would argue that Israel's identity and character is crucial, even though it might seem abstract for now. But the way to make it less abstract is to get the public to believe again, and the public will only believe if they see the other side making moves. So I think that's legit. I will tell a story about Rabin. When I was a journalist, I interviewed him, and I said kind of what you said, and I said to him, Mr. Prime Minister, you know, you did this interim agreement, but if you were going to do a deal, why didn't you go the whole way? I ended up writing a book on this topic called Making Peace with the PLO on Israeli decision-making in 1993 in the Oslo Accord. And he said, look, easy for you to say. It wasn't easy for me to say. I was just a journalist at the time. And he said, I had a coalition of one. Like I had a majority of one. This is as far as I could go. And so now the Palestinians, without boring people about details, A plus B areas is 40% of the West Bank. A area of the West Bank are the Palestinian cities that are run by the Palestinian Authority. B areas are the environs outside the cities. And one is 18, one is 22%, it's 40% of the West Bank. It's not 100% of the West Bank. 60% has not yet been decided. And I know that, you know, people can argue about the 40, but at least, look, what people need to understand sometimes is take a zoom out a little bit and say, here are two nationalist movements that basically did not engage each other for close to a century. And they were living in a small patch of land. Too much history, too little geography. But geography is very stubborn. So the Oslo moment was this ability to say, we have to find a way to reconcile two opposing national movements. And maybe we don't solve all the problems at once, but at least we start down that road. And I think that was the right approach. If you could have solved all the problems, you know, great. But you didn't have that majority to do it. And the majority erodes when they see Hamas terrorism. And by the way, the Palestinians don't trust the Israeli side either. I want to keep emphasizing that too, that it's both sides. So I'm looking for gestures that, in my view, will return this sense of possibility, even if it's not a sense of probability, but at least get the publics to believe that there's some hope, not in a false, gimmicky way, but in a real way, to deal with things they actually care about. And I think that land and terrorism are the two things that the sides care about, and that is the best chance to get, you know, to revive this sense of purpose. Even if it's a single, it's not a home run. I was part of an effort to hit a home run, and I don't regret trying, but when you fail the third time, you know, you see that the Venn diagram between these two leaders just don't overlap on the 5 core issues. Now, if you had different leaders and different publics who were willing to gamble, you know, to do more, to risk more, I'd say go for it. But I think one of my lessons is I'd rather see success, like to take Ben Gurion, rather get half a loaf and see success than, you know, go for it all and fail. So that's kind of how I see it. Yeah. Yes, sir.
Moments ago, you talked about the conversations with the embassy in Jerusalem. You said you generally agreed with the decision, but you think that something more could have been gotten from it.
Right.
And my question is, Clinton, when he was president, promised to move the embassy to Jerusalem.
Right.
As did Obama, and maybe earlier,
Bush.
President Bush. When was it ever the case in world history that a country did not have the right to designate its own
capital?
And suddenly Israel was separate, was different from every other country in the world.
Okay, here's
Why should Israel have done anything, or what should have been?
I got it. So here would be what I would answer. This issue of Jerusalem is not like, you know, a typical capital. As you know, it was a contested issue that Israel under Oslo, and like I said, I wrote a book on this, agreed to negotiate the status of the city. So it's not like saying, well, they don't recognize Washington, D.C., or they don't recognize Mexico City, or they don't recognize Ottawa. I would agree with that. But those are cities that are not being contested by opposing national movements. And Israel agreed to that kind of negotiation. Now, I still justify it. And I was asked by Judy Woodruff on PBS NewsHour about it. And I said that, like I said, you know, West Jerusalem, no matter what, is going to be Israeli. Have the Palestinians say that. even if every single inch of East Jerusalem goes to the Palestinian side. But we all know, first of all, it isn't going to work that way, because the Palestinians know that the Jewish neighbors of East Jerusalem are going to stay. So I don't see the contradiction in making the move. But I just feel the U.S., to get to this gentleman's question, has a finite amount of cards. I would have liked to have seen something that gets us closer to the singles. So that's why I would have tried to do it. But I'm supportive of the move. And I realize nuanced positions are always going to get attacked from the right and the left. But I felt that was, you know, I supported the move. I just would have, I wish it was, you know, kind of configured a little differently, but in and of itself, and my prediction is that if a Democratic administration wins, I don't know about Mr. Sanders, but I think everybody else, nobody's going back to what was before Trump made his decision. That is an irreversible move. Now, some might say, I want to open up a consulate in East Jerusalem for Palestinians, and that could happen. But no one is going to move that embassy back to Tel Aviv. Yes, sir.
So I'm going to ask about Sharon's withdrawal.
Yeah.
I agree with you that it was a courageous decision that she made for the vote. And I understand that had good reasons to think that it should be done.
Right.
I thought it should be done also. But I think an awful lot of people who are not on the right thing, but would say that it ended up, at least the way it was done unilaterally, being a rather bad decision.
Right. No, it's a great point, and it's something that I discussed with Israelis at the time. I said, you know, you don't want a situation where you take the keys of Gaza, throw it over the fence, and see who catches the keys. And you do things unilaterally, there's risks. The problem is, on the Palestinian side, to be fair to Sharon, there was an all or nothing. And that has been, I'm sorry to say, maximalist politics. It shows that whenever it's all or nothing in the Mideast, it's nothing. And the Palestinian view is, you want us to take Gaza off your hands, we're not going to do it unless you give us Jerusalem or all these other things we want as part of the home run. And I feel that, you know, it was phrased to him as all or nothing. Now, could he have at least coordinated certain things with Abbas, even optically, that would look more that it was a coordinated unilateralism or something that was not, even if it wasn't negotiated. I told Palestinians at the time, I said, if Sharon says it, he's going to do this. This is going to happen. He's a bulldozer, but he's a bulldozer in a way that he's going to go through with what he said. And I wish it was coordinated, but it wasn't that the Palestinians would say, I will deal with you incrementally. Their approach was, it's all or nothing, and that has been the straitjacket. I feel that's where the failure on the Palestinian side has been. All or nothing means nothing. Now, people say, I agree with you, if there was a way to avoid that unilateral view, because Hamas took advantage of it. And they ran in the February 2006 elections, January 2006 elections, on the theme of, we got Israel out of Gaza, because it wasn't negotiated. So better resistance, better killing people, blowing them up will get you results. And that's something you don't want to reinforce, obviously. And that's why unilateralism, to me, was regrettable. But the alternatives were not nuanced. The alternatives were agree to everything, which Israel wasn't going to do at that time, or status quo. Now again, I think cosmetically, they could have coordinated certain deployments of it in a better way, and Sharon had his own politics with that. But it wouldn't have fundamentally changed. I don't think you could have really had a negotiation over Gaza separate from everything else. That was the Palestinian view. And look, to me, I'm like I said, with all my critiques, all my criticism, I noticed one thing. I don't see a mass movement in Israel go back to Gaza. I don't hear settlers saying we want to move thousands of people into Gaza. The public that is so against the way it was done is the same public that believes it's better that they're out. And they don't want to relive it. And the 8,500 settlers there that were protected by tons of soldiers, among 2 million Palestinians who did want them there, And the public, will complain correctly along the lines you said about the way it was done, but not that it was done, and that they don't want to go back, and there's no movement. That to me, 15 years, 14 years after the Gaza pullout, that to me is the ultimate test. Is there a groundswell? Let us back into Gaza. We want to resettle. I don't see that. So I know it's out there. So yeah, I have some of the same criticisms you do, but in the big picture, I don't see people wanting to undo it. Any yes?
With more Israelis buying property in Jerusalem away from Palestinians, do you see if it does get to a majority Israeli, would other countries move their seat for Jerusalem?
What is interesting is that, like the Czechs, I think the Russians, of all people, have made statements about West Jerusalem. Now, the Trump announcement doesn't use the word West. It says Jerusalem, doesn't use the word West Jerusalem. It's all basically in West Jerusalem. There's a little part of that property which might just spill over into a no man's land. But the West Jerusalem part that's where I think if there's movement over time, there'll be more countries saying, West Jerusalem. Look, part of the problem is you've got a Palestinian boycott of the Trump administration that has gone on since then. So a lot of the countries don't want to be seen in this sensitive period as like pouring oil on a fire in that regard. So, but I think in terms of West Jerusalem over time, it'll happen. And maybe, one way it could happen is, I don't know, but I'm speculating. I don't speak from knowledge. But if you see people saying, I'll set up an embassy in West Jerusalem and I'll set up a consulate for Palestinians in East Jerusalem, could you see that? Now that's something right now this government of Netanyahu does not want to encourage, clearly. But, I wouldn't rule that out in the future government. So, we'll have to see at this point. But I think with time there will be more embassies. I think you will look back and say, how was it that there weren't? But I think it'll happen over time. But it might come with some offsetting moves, less consular services for Palestinians on the other side of the sea. Yeah. Dr. Walter.
I'm interested in your podcast.
Good. Thank you. Great.
And I'd like to ask two related questions. One is, what kinds of insights are you getting, or do you expect to get from this story to help you comprehend the present a little bit better? And secondly, the list of people who are helpful, thoughtful, like form on the list.
He was the first one. So, yeah, my goal, for the book that I'm trying to always look at, it's not just college students, but how people consume information today. And I see it also in Washington. I've made over 135 visits to college campuses. I'm not saying they're all to 135 campuses, because maybe it's about 100, because some of them I've been to more than once. Now Michigan State is my second time. I feel that the Washington policy community that I'm a part of, there's an explosion of interest in podcasts. A lot of us are stuck in traffic, going to work, coming from work, and we're tired of listening to the same radio station. It could be when we're in the gym, working out. Give people 30 minutes. And, the nuance in me says I'd rather it be 4 hours and 30 minutes, but I'd rather it be 30 minutes that people will listen to. We got audio clips spliced in, although not the first episode, because there's no radio in 1917 at the time of the Balfour Declaration. But the second episode we released today, and every Wednesday we're releasing an episode. Michael talked about the hidden role of Woodrow Wilson in the Balfour Declaration. And it was striking to me. It's hard for me to be generic. I'm not done recording all at the studio. We want the studio quality. It's got to be really top quality. I'm halfway through it. And I'm just, I wanted people who've written in depth about a given period. And then if people like 30 minutes of Mike Lauren's book, on faith, fantasy, and power, maybe they'll buy the book. Or Ronald Radosh's book called Safe Haven on the internal drama in the Truman administration, which we released today, to recognize Israel, the debate between Marshall and Truman over this. So, you know, maybe it'll be in 2 steps, but you got to meet people where they are. Now, what are the insights? Can I make something generic? My hope is that historians, if they're vivid in the way they tell history, they can make the past come alive. And the more they make the past come alive, they'll hopefully ignite interest in reading about the past, but they'll also realize the past isn't always past. That a lot of things today, like I found in writing this book with Dennis about demographics and land, these were things Ben Gurion thought about in the 30s, the 40s, you know, and so a lot of these issues are alive. So I'm hoping the context that we provide of the past makes it vivid for people and makes them understand that there's a whole history to these issues. And when they read the newspaper, a light bulb goes off in their head and says, aha, oh, it didn't start here. Oh, it's got roots, these issues. And it contextualizes the present better. That's my hope. I really hope people listen, you know, and like I said, free, subscribe, decision points. We have bookmarks. We have some in the back when you walk in to take, and also people buy the book. Also, I'll throw them in. But anyway, it's an honor to do this series, and I'm just hoping historians and policymakers will use the period that they've written about, and just fascinating stories. Just the stories are amazing. But you can say I'm not objective, but I hope if you listen, you'll say you're right. Yeah, Ellen.
So it seems like from your analysis and in the book, there are 3 major factors that make these leaders stand out. One is they're willing to take political risks to themselves. 2 is the risks of inaction or the status quo being larger than the risks of action. And 3rd, maybe a certain degree of pragmatism. And that seems to make a lot of sense, and therefore to move to this incrementalism, or maybe you theoretically can move through the 4 next leaders, each, as you say, in your visual analogy, making a single to eventually, incrementally come to the home run. And that's certainly one venue for doing it. But I just want to throw a couple things out there. What about a bold leader that wants to make more dramatic change versus would Sadat even fall into that, you know, category? And could that compensate for one of the flaws of incrementalism, which is that incrementalism allows the spoilers to spoil, right? And so, how do you? It largely makes sense what you're saying, right? That something is better than nothing, and reaching for the pragmatic, you know, leader. But are we also kind of missing kind of the more bold leaders that maybe you do need to avoid spoilers from spoilers?
No, that's an excellent point. Excellent. But look, my point is that it's all a function of circumstance. I'm not a believer ideologically in gradualism. I'm just saying, given the leaders that are, the circumstances that as complex as it is, that's, I think, the best thing you can attain. But when Sadat comes off an airplane, okay, on November 1977, right? You know, this month, whatever it is, 42 years ago, and says something so bold, you know, no more war, no more bloodshed, and goes to the Knesset. That was so earth-shattering that the result was a binary result. I mean, it was a boldness on the Begin side, too. Get off of all the Sinai. Don't get off half of the Sinai. Get rid of all the settlements of the Sinai. I mean, a bold step was met with a bold step. And because I get back to that gentleman's question behind you about, you know, gestures on each side, it's because you need the public with you. And if there's bold steps, I mean, if a Saudi king, or, you know, or whatever, or an Emirati king would come to the Knesset and said, we accept you. That's it, we accept you. We want you to be part of this region. In my view, and I'm bringing Abbas with me here. Abbas is standing next to me in the Knesset. You would see a much bolder Israeli response. The problem is that each side is kind of frozen in their base and in their objections because each side has valid points. It's not like they're completely crazy, you know. But clearly, greater boldness by Sadat is what allowed boldness on Israel. So I want to be clear, I don't want to be misinterpreted. I'm not for gradualism's sake. Because what Begin did, I don't think was gradual. I think was very bold. And what when Ben Gurion does what he does to establish the state, it wasn't a halfway measure. But I'm saying, given the complexity of the issues and the leaders on both sides, I think that's the most you can expect now. But if a different leader emerges on the Arab side, then more will be expected of the Israeli side too. So I just want to be clear that I'm not a believer in the Ure, that this is gradualism. I just think things are stuck. And I want to unstuck what's stuck. And if we had a bold leader on either side, somebody on the Arab side, you would expect more boldness on the Israeli side. That's all. I want to be clear, so I actually thank you for asking that.